Welcome to another episode of Management Unplugged by Garang. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into an area that profoundly influences our choices every single day: behavioral science. Specifically, we're looking at the nuanced concept of nudging. Our mission is to tackle a really crucial question: nudge or manipulate, drawing the line in behavioral science. We've got some exceptional source material today, mainly focusing on part 5 of the, well, hugely influential book Nudge. This section goes deep into the critiques, the complexities surrounding this whole idea. So our objective is to unpack the philosophical, ethical, and, practical challenges of nudging, helping you understand precisely where the lines are drawn between helpful guidance and undue influence. Let's get started.
Yeah, what's particularly striking in our source material is how the authors of Nudge themselves, they directly confront the storm of criticism their work ignited. They point out that the book, which honestly they initially didn't expect to gain such a wide audience, it not only resonated broadly, but also drew fire from, like, across the political
Hey,
spectrum.
really, both sides.
Yeah, from both the right and the left. It's actually fascinating to explore why such a seemingly straightforward concept like nudging can be so contentious, and what that tells us about human nature and policy.
Okay, so let's start right there at the heart of that contention. Libertarian paternalism, that's the term they coined that seems to, well, irk so many people. What exactly did the authors mean by that?
Right. Well, they're very precise in their definition. For them, libertarian just means choice preserving.
Mm-hmm.
An ideal nudge, they argue, imposes minimal cost, like almost zero cost, on anyone who prefers an alternative path. To really emphasize this ease of opting out, they even consider titles like one-click paternalism, which is terrible, but you get the idea.
Huh, yeah, I can see why they didn't go with that one.
Exactly. Think of it like a GPS suggesting a turn it guides you, sure, but it certainly doesn't complain or block the road if you decide to go straight. Now, if opting out is difficult or confusing or deceptive, that's when they call it sludge.
Sludge, okay, got it.
And sludge is clearly negative, a key factor to watch out for in policy analysis. When, as for paternalism, they define it not as imposing their personal preferences on people, but as guiding people toward choices they would likely make themselves if they were fully informed and free from common cognitive biases.
Ah, so helping people achieve their own goals better.
Precisely. It's a paternalism of means, not ends. They're very explicit that their own personal tastes, whether they prefer wine over Diet Coke or long dinners over philosophical arguments, have absolutely nothing to do with their policy recommendations.
That makes sense in theory, but it also raises a really important practical question, doesn't it? What about the choice architects themselves, the people actually designing these nudges? I mean, are they always perfectly good-hearted, perfectly smart, and perfectly motivated? Because that seems unlikely.
That's a crucial point, and the authors are refreshingly candid about it.
Yeah.
They are very clear. Choice architects are human. They're fallible. They can be self-interested. They can even be outright malicious. They point to things like the financial crisis where, system design had massive unintended and harmful consequences, or the general rise of authoritarian governments, bad actors in the private sector. The world isn't solely populated by benevolent geniuses.
Right. So if choice architects can be bad actors, then why even bother with nudges? Wouldn't that just give them more tools to, well, potentially manipulate us?
This is where their core argument really, really clarifies things. Choice architecture and nudging are, they're inevitable.
Inevitable. How sad.
You literally cannot avoid them. Any environment you create, any form you design, any default option you set, that is choice architecture. That is a nudge.
Yeah.
Objecting to nudges per se is like objecting to, air. It just exists.
Okay, I see.
So because it's unavoidable, the real question becomes, how can we design these environments responsibly, ethically? And they argue that precisely because choice architects are fallible, nudges, which allow easy opt-outs, are actually preferable to things like coercion or mandates.
Ah, because the opt-out reduces the risk.
Exactly. It significantly reduces the risks of malevolent design because individuals ultimately keep their freedom of choice. Now, they acknowledge the concern about villains misusing their ideas, sure, but they kind of suggest that, maybe worry more about climate change. That presents far greater, more pressing dangers. The existence of bad actors isn't new. What's new is our awareness of how design impacts choice.
Okay, that's a compelling argument. But one of the most persistent fears you hear about nudging is the slippery slope. You know that idea. First it's a nudge, then it's a shove, then it's a ban. What's the author's take on that common apprehension?
Right, the slippery slope. It's a critique they address with both humor and rigor. They playfully introduced this term, bathmophobia.
Bathmophobia.
Yeah, the fear of falling down a slope. They suggest it might actually be an underlying psychological bias that makes people overly susceptible to the slippery slope argument itself.
Yeah.
Basically, a slippery slope argument claims that if we allow X, say a benign nudge, it will inevitably lead to Y and Z, coercion, bad outcomes, even if X itself is totally fine.
So don't do X unless you want Z.
Exactly. But they quickly point out the fundamental problem. Most slippery slope arguments, they lack actual evidence of a slope existing. They offer some vivid historical examples. Remember Justice Scalia's famous broccoli mandate argument against the Affordable Care Act?
Vaguely, yeah. If they can make you buy insurance, they can make you buy broccoli.
That was the implication. Or think about opponents of women's suffrage predicting, a race of degenerates or an all-female political leadership. The track record of these dire forecasts, frankly, it's not stellar.
Right.
So a key insight here for you, the listener, is to always ask for the evidence when someone makes a slippery slope argument. Is this a real documented trajectory, or is it just a hypothetical fear driven by anxiety?
That's a really powerful way to frame it. But what about a more nuanced version, something like nudge creep? The idea that a nudge might become the new normal and subtly pave the way for more extreme interventions later.
Yeah, that's a more refined critique associated with thinkers like Glenn Whitman. He uses this concept called extremeness aversion.
Extremeness aversion. Okay.
It's our tendency to avoid choices at either end of a spectrum, right? So he might argue that, say, legally mandated savings plans with an opt-out become the new middle ground. Then maybe auto-enrollment with a Save More Tomorrow program becomes the next middle. And then potentially mandatory enrollment with no opt-out is seen as just a small step further.
I can see the logic there.
It sounds logical.
Yeah.
However, the authors counter this by looking at the real world. In the, 12-plus years since Nudge first came out, while things like automatic enrollment and Save More Tomorrow have become common, they say they are completely unaware of any trend towards removing the right to opt out. They're very firm. Nudging as such is inevitable, and by definition, nudges maintain freedom of choice.
So the opt-out is the key safeguard.
It's the fundamental differentiator. You can have warnings on shrimp packets without ever moving to ban shrimp entirely. If an option is sensible and well-designed, it tends to just get used more, not morph into something coercive.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly, critics from a more libertarian perspective often argue strongly for active choosing over defaults. Just give people the information and let them decide, period. What's the author's perspective on that?
They definitely express sympathy for that view,
Right.
especially coming from people who prioritize liberty above, pretty much everything else. And they acknowledge, active choosing is a valid form of choice architecture. Sometimes it's an excellent idea. They specifically mention organ donation. There, they actually prefer something called prompted choice over required consent.
Prompted choice.
Meaning you're explicitly asked to make a decision yes or no rather than being defaulted in or out. They feel active choosing is most suitable when the choices are relatively simple, clear-cut.
But not always.
Right. They push back by asking, should people always be required to actively choose? Think about complex decisions like selecting from, say, hundreds of mutual funds for your retirement plan. Forcing everyone to actively choose in that situation. They call that dubious and, you could argue, pretty paternalistic in itself.
Because you're forcing a choice they might not want to make.
Exactly. Their point is that people often choose not to choose, maybe because it's complex, or they trust the default. And that preference should be respected. Think about, the default setting for your car headlights. Would you really want to manually set them every single time you drive? Probably not. Well-chosen defaults can be a blessing, reducing cognitive load, improving outcomes. In many areas, they just work really well.
Okay, that makes sense. Then there's another critique you often hear. Don't nudge, boost. The idea that we should just focus on educating people, improving their capacities, rather than subtly guiding them. That sounds incredibly sensible, right? Focus on education.
And they wholeheartedly agree. Education, boosting, which means improving people's underlying skills and competences, it's incredibly valuable. They're teachers themselves. They champion this. In fact, many nudges, like clear disclosures or warnings, do educate people. Their core message is really practical and direct. Why do we have to choose one over the other? Do both.
It's not an either.
Not at all. They see no inherent conflict. There's no reason to hold back on potentially helpful nudges just because education is also good. However, while they support education, they're also realistic about its limits. I mean, be honest, how much of your high school chemistry or trig do you remember?
Not much.
Right. They cite a big meta-analysis on financial literacy training. It showed the effects are often pretty modest. They tend to fade after about 2 years, and they're most effective when delivered just in time, like teaching high schoolers about student loans right before they actually need to make decisions about them.
So general education isn't always the silver bullet.
The world is just really complex. Even experts struggle with decisions like choosing the best mortgage. So their argument is clear. It's not nudging or educating. It's about using both strategies together to help people navigate this complex world.
Okay. Now, what about the argument that nudges are inherently sneaky or manipulative because they can affect people without their, explicit knowledge? Unlike a tax or a mandate where you know exactly what's happening, is nudging inherently covert?
Yeah, that's a common charge. But for the vast majority of nudges, they find this objection kind of hard to understand. Things like calorie labels, warning signs, default rules, they're generally very transparent. I mean, if they're truly hidden, they often just won't work anyway.
Or they become sludge.
Or they become sludge. Exactly. Like if you're automatically enrolled in a green energy program, you absolutely should be told about it clearly. That's transparency. Now, it is true that some nudges can work, even if you don't consciously focus on the design behind them. Think of that classic example, a cafeteria putting healthy food options in more prominent, accessible locations. The design isn't hidden. You can see the fruit is right there.
Right. But the reason might not be obvious.
Exactly. The reason for that specific placement might not be immediately apparent to every single customer. But, crucially, the authors point out that transparency doesn't actually seem to reduce a nudge's impact.
Really? You'd think knowing you're being nudged might make you resist.
Sometimes, maybe. But often, transparency can even increase the impact, perhaps by conveying valuable information or building trust. Like, oh, they're putting the healthy stuff here because it's better for me.
Okay, so if most nudges aren't really covert, what does constitute manipulation then? How do we confidently draw that line?
Well, philosophers generally define manipulation as an action that doesn't adequately respect a person's capacity for rational deliberation.
Okay. Not respecting their ability to think things through clearly.
Exactly. So based on that, most nudges, like a simple appointment reminder text or a clear calorie label, they're clearly not manipulative. They actually enhance your ability to make an informed choice, if anything. However, sludge, remember that. Situations where people aren't told about a default or where it's made incredibly difficult or confusing to opt out that absolutely can be manipulative, that's where the line starts to get crossed.
So how do we police that line?
This is where they introduce a really important concept, the publicity principle, which they draw from the philosopher John Rawls. The principle basically suggests that no choice architect, public or private, should adopt a policy that they wouldn't be able or willing to defend publicly and transparently to the people affected by it.
Okay, so if you wouldn't want it on the front page of the newspaper.
Pretty much. They endorse this for two key reasons. First, the practical one. It helps avoid major embarrassment or backlash if the policy does eventually get disclosed. But more importantly, it's about fundamental respect. Organizations that adopt policies they can't openly defend are essentially treating individuals like tools, like objects, to be manipulated for their own ends, rather than as autonomous people capable of reason.
That's a powerful ethical standard. Do they give examples?
Yeah, they have a fantastic one. The Drink More Water sign at the Lollapalooza Music Festival. It was really clever, used loss aversion, reminding people dehydration would ruin their fun. Totally transparent, well-designed nudge. But contrast that with, say, the classic hypothetical of subliminal messages flashing on a screen like buy 10 copies of Nudge.
Right, totally different.
Totally different. They are unequivocally clear. They do not embrace subliminal messaging. They don't count it as libertarian paternalism, even if it were somehow used for a supposedly good outcome. The publicity principle hits this directly. It forces transparency in things like fuel economy labels, organ donation defaults, and critically, it explicitly forbids sneaky stuff like subliminal ads. It ensures choice architects respect people, not just use them.
Okay. Thinking about really big problems now, like climate change. If nudges are so versatile, do they risk maybe discouraging governments from taking stronger, more direct actions, like taxes or regulations? Or nudges just, tweaks that don't go far enough for the really serious issues?
That's definitely a concern raised by some critics, particularly from the progressive side.
Mhm.
They worry nudges might be seen as an easy out, inadequate for these huge systemic problems. And the authors readily acknowledge this. Nudges are simply not enough for fundamental problems like, murder or rape or massive industrial pollution where people are imposing direct, serious harms on others. They describe nudges aptly as a Swiss Army knife.
Versatile, but not for heavy lifting.
Exactly. Incredibly versatile, very effective in certain situations, but it's definitely not a jackhammer or a bulldozer. By themselves, nudges are just insufficient to control major negative externalities like pollution. And they give clear examples of how taxes, subsidies, mandates, bans, these stronger tools, still have a vital place, often used effectively alongside nudges. Think about countries in Scandinavia dealing with alcohol. They use a mix: high taxes, nudges against drunk driving, and stiff fines. They argue pretty strongly that the availability of nudges is actually unlikely to discourage officials from taking stronger measures when they're really needed. They say they've basically never seen that happen in government. They kind of call it more of a debater's point than a real-world obstacle.
Interesting. So if nudges aren't always enough, when should we move from nudging to more forceful interventions like bans or mandates? Where do they suggest we draw that line? It feels fuzzy.
It is fuzzy, and they admit reasonable people can disagree. There are no absolute hard and fast stopping points here. However, their guiding principle, their lodestar as they put it, is human well-being. They point to things like financial cooling off periods. It's a good example of a mild intervention, like the 3-day right to cancel a door-to-door sales contract or mandatory waiting periods for divorce in some places.
Right, giving people time to think.
Exactly. These make sense when decisions are infrequent, complex, and emotions might be running high. They just ensure a crucial period for sober reflection before something potentially irreversible happens. They stress that mandates and bans become clearly justified when people's choices significantly harm others. Think assault, theft, greenhouse gas emissions. And they also support interventions when choices primarily harm one's own future self in serious ways. Smoking is the classic example, where taxes and even bans on certain products are widely accepted. So they explicitly say they have no objection to foundational policies like Social Security, or more recent things like trans fat bans, or classic safety rules like seatbelt laws. The core idea is when choices impose serious, often irreversible harms either on others or your future self, moving beyond nudges is justified.
Okay. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us, for you listening, trying to make sense of this? It really seems nudging is far from a simple black and white thing. It's
Okay, well, it exists on a complex spectrum, right? Between genuinely helpful guidance and something that could definitely cross the line into manipulation. Absolutely. And the authors, despite all the critiques, they actually conclude on a remarkably optimistic note. They highlight the enormous progress and, frankly, the huge potential in applying behavioral science globally to everything from pandemics to climate change. And they emphasize a really fundamental point. All policies, really all products and services too, inherently require some form of choice architecture. Just like all buildings need some kind of design, you can't not design the choice environment. So the biggest opportunities, they argue, come from integrating this behavioral science thinking right at the start of policy creation, not just tacking it on later.
like building it into the foundation.
Precisely. They use this compelling example of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business building. The architects didn't just design a structure, they actually studied user behavior. They learned faculty really valued those spontaneous random encounters with colleagues.
Ah, the water cooler effect.
Kind of, yeah. So they designed the building specifically to encourage that, creating spaces that were functional, beautiful, and aligned with how people actually behave. And similarly, policymakers should design environments with human behavior in mind from the get-go, making safe or beneficial choices the easiest path, systematically eliminating that sludge we talked about. This kind of thinking, they note, is thankfully becoming more routine, extending far beyond just specialized nudge units.
So this deep dive really makes it clear, doesn't it? The debate isn't really about whether to nudge, because that's happening anyway, it's inevitable. It's truly about how to nudge, how to do it ethically, transparently, effectively. The goal, as they put it, should always be to nudge for good.
And that perhaps leads to a final thought for you to consider. How might you apply that publicity principle, the idea of only adopting policies or practices you'd be willing and able to defend publicly, to a decision you're facing, whether it's at work or in your community or even personally? How can you ensure both transparency and genuine respect for others' rational deliberation?
Something to definitely reflect on. We really hope this deep dive has given you a significant shortcut to being well informed on this crucial and honestly fascinating topic. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.